I started the Simple Garden 5 years ago as an attempt to be able to grow a lot of food without having to put in a lot of time, and accepting that I was going to have to give up a fair amount of choice and diversity in the process. It is essentially a simple crop rotation and soil fertility management method that focuses on growing 4 different staple crops for storage to provide us with lots to eat in the autumn, through the winter, and into the spring. And for each of the past 5 years, I've been growing the same 4 crops with essentially the same techniques with occasional adjustments, and I think this garden has been quite successful overall. But with fewer crops, it means that any issues that arise with one of them will have a larger effect on the overall yield of the garden. And the 4 crops that I've chosen can be tricky enough to grow, despite 3 of them being very common crops here in Ireland. In some significant ways, this garden is improving each year, with some key setbacks and unexpected successes, all of which raise some interesting questions. Perhaps the most unusual part of this garden is the use of sheet composting over 1/3 of the soil area underneath the squash plants in one of the 3 crop rotations. I've used a wide range of different materials for the sheet composting, and for the last year I relied primarily on hay and other organic material from clearing overgrown sections of the surrounding landscape. This rough material was topped up with lots of nettles, comfrey leaves, and grass clippings from the fresh growth of the spring. And the squash plants grew quite strongly and seemed more vigorous than the same plants in 2 of the other gardens. We were able to harvest 140 kilograms of squash from the 9 plants of this patch, which was a bit less than the previous 2 years, and the average weight of each squash has been fairly consistent over the years at around 4 kilograms each, which is what I would expect from a hybrid variety. Comparing all the crops of this same squash variety that have been grown in the outside gardens over the past 5 years, the yield and average size is slightly lower in this garden, but within the same range. But the consistently larger number of squash produced per plant in the Simple Garden over the 5 years is quite striking, and I wonder if this is due to the sheet composting, which is one of the key differences between this and the other gardens. Because I have been using significantly different materials each season for the sheet composting, I don't think this difference is due to the balance of nutrients that would be supplied, but more because the decomposition is taking place directly over the roots of the squash plants. It is possible that this decomposition is providing a little bit of more warmth for the soil and sheltering it from the cooling influence of the winds and insulating the soil from cooling down in the autumn. All of this would possibly benefit these heat-loving plants, but the covering would also prevent the sun from warming up the soil in the spring. Whatever the reason, this crop did grow quite well, though it was a bit more delayed in maturing, which might explain some of the lower yields. But I was concerned that some of the squash would not ripen fully. But we have been pleasantly surprised by the excellent quality of at least some of the squash from this garden, which has had a very full flavor and was quite sweet. And a few of them were possibly the best tasting squash we've ever produced, or at least they're better tasting than what I ever thought would be possible to produce in this maritime climate here in Ireland, and I don't really know why they were so successful. The simple crop rotation plan that I follow for this garden has potatoes being grown in the bed after the squash, which starts with raking off the remains of the compost from the year before and digging over the soil for the potatoes. I've been adding chicken manure pellets to the trenches created for the 4 rows of potatoes, as I wasn't sure if there would be enough fertility left over in the soil from the sheet composting the previous year. This is the only garden that I've been growing main crop potatoes, and I grew 4 different varieties last year that I don't have a lot of experience with, so I can't really compare how well they did. I don't think fertility was a limiting issue here, and I wonder how much the yield might have dropped if I hadn't topped up the fertility at the beginning of the season. After digging out the potatoes each autumn, we have been preparing and covering 2 beds for the onions and main crop carrots to be planted in the following spring, combining to form the 3rd year of the rotation plan. And last year we didn't add any additional fertility or compost to this soil for the carrots and onions, so the crops were still relying on what was left over from the sheet composting and the chicken manure pellets after the 2 heavy feeding crops of squash and potatoes. The crop of onions last year was great, the best crop yet out of this garden despite some issues, and there has been continual increase in yield over the past few years. So I don't think lack of fertility has been an issue. But the carrot crop was quite poor last year, with a yield only a bit better than previous year, which was itself a dramatic decline from the very first season, which was one of the best carrot crops I had ever produced. I don't think the poor results this year were a fertility issue and was more related to poor germination, some pest damage, and excessive amounts of forking of the roots. I still don't know why there has been so much forking of the carrots in the past few years, and I wonder if it is because of how and when the soil was cultivated, or if it's some other factor that I'm not aware of. There were also pest issues with the carrots, including slugs killing off the young seedlings, which probably caused the biggest reduction of yield this past year. We were also not so successful at keeping out the carrot root fly last year, probably because we didn't have the cover over the crops early enough, and the burrowing larvae added to the forking of the roots to further reduce the usable portion of this crop. There are, of course, ways to deal with these pests, but we didn't use them early enough or consistently enough to be able to prevent damage, and with the crop of onions, we didn't keep the protective measures in place for long enough. The numerous jackdaws and rooks in the area seem to enjoy pulling the onion sets out of the ground, probably in search of worms around the developing roots. So we usually cover the beds with netting or some other covering held off the ground with hoops. But last year we removed the netting too early, thinking that the plants were large enough, and quite a few of the young plants were pulled out of the ground or had their leaves snapped off in the attempt. About 20% of the plants in this large crop were damaged before we put the netting back on, and the great yield of onions from last year would have been even better if we had just waited a little longer. With the potato crop, we probably waited too long to harvest, and a considerable number of tubers were damaged by slugs. This is a fairly usual occurrence in these gardens and seems to be caused by a species of slug that spends most of its time underground, and therefore it seems to be able to escape our usual slug control methods. So I think harvesting earlier is probably the best option for reducing damage and is probably the better option with the carrot crop as well. In the past, the crop of onions were badly affected by downy mildew, compounded by the wet weather that we often seem to get as the bulbs are maturing. Harvesting the plants earlier would have been one way to deal with this, even though it would reduce the yield. But in the past 2 years, we've been using sets from different variety of onions, which are apparently resistant to downy mildew, and we've seen definite improvements, especially this year. And this change of varieties is likely the main reason for the improved yields. With the 4 varieties of potatoes that we planted this year, one was not very productive, and I suspect it is just an unsuitable variety. Another variety had an equally low yield, but this was because blight affected the leaves quite badly, and we cut down all the stems to prevent the blight spreading or affecting the buried tubers. The other 2 varieties are definitely worth growing again, though one seemed to die back early, and the other seemed to keep growing for quite a bit longer, unaffected by blight or other diseases. So, growing the right variety is a good way to improve the overall yield of potatoes, and if we had grown only the 2 more productive varieties, then we could have harvested an extra 50 kilograms or 25% more from this patch last year. And it is possible that other varieties would do even better, and it is good to have a few different types to eat. So this year we're trying another 2 in addition to the successful ones from last year. With the carrot crop last year, we grew 5 different varieties, and some seem to do better than others, but I would be hesitant to select any because of the other issues that we had. So we're planning to grow a range of different main crop varieties of carrots again this year, hoping to find ones that grow well and taste great, so that we can get back to the possibility of growing an abundant and flavorful crop of this important vegetable. With the squash crop, I think we might stick with the same variety to see how it goes next season again. And we could do the same thing with the onion crop, buying in another batch of sets for the same successful variety. Although the crop was really good last year, we still had quite a few of the onions decay or rot in storage, which apparently can be more common when you're growing them from sets rather than from seeds. So we are going to try to grow onion crop from seeds this season in this garden, and as I don't know what variety would be best, we're going to take the opportunity of doing a broad variety trial to get a better sense of the range of possibilities of using seeds. This will no doubt take more time, and the yield will likely be a lot less next year, as some of the varieties just won't grow well at all. But we're hoping to find a few varieties that will be as productive and disease-free as our crop was last year, but with better storage possibilities. One of the key benefits of this garden has been less weeding, partially because the squash bed is covered, and the potato plants can outcompete the weeds, leaving only the onion and carrot patches to weed. And we have been covering this entire garden with ground cover fabric over winter, which suppresses existing weeds and prevents more pernicious weeds from becoming established. This definitely reduces the amount of time spent weeding, but it does require all that material and the effort that it takes to keep it secure and adequately weighed down so that it doesn't blow away in the wind. There are also definite benefits in protecting the soil from the heavy rains of the winter, and it is really easy to sow crops into the clean and prepared beds. But I do wonder how well this garden would work without these big sheets of plastic. The recent shift to using rough grasses and other biomass from the surrounding landscape as sheet composting to cover the squash patch means that this plastic fabric is not as necessary for part of the garden at least. And while it is useful to have a place to put all this overgrown rough material that I collect from around the area, it does come at the risk of bringing in additional seeds from the grasses and other plants. And I wonder if several years of this approach will significantly increase the store of viable weed seeds that are in the soil, that we will only end up having to weed out of the carrot and onion patch. Overall, I think this has become quite a successful garden, as it produces a lot of food with considerably less work than in the other gardens. The overall yield last season was a bit lower than in previous years, but still more than half a ton of food was produced in the 100 square meter area, with a total of about 30 hours spent working in this garden. This translates to about 17 kilograms of vegetables to put into storage for every hour that we work throughout the full year in this garden, though probably a bit less if we discard some of the more pest-damaged crops. That is considerably more than any of the other gardens that we manage, which would usually be in the range of 5 to 7 kilograms per hour, though we do get a lot more choice. And there's always room for improvement and quite a few questions that I'd be interested in exploring in order to improve the quality, resilience, and productivity of this garden. Such as, why do the squash plants produce more fruit in this garden, and is the sheet composting involved? Can the fertility be improved, or what would happen if the concentrated fertility wasn't added? Are the carrots forking because of how and when the soil is cultivated, and if it isn't that, what is causing so much forking of these roots? Can pest damage be radically reduced by focusing on better timing of the control measures and timing of harvesting? Will selecting appropriate varieties deal with all of the disease issues? How much can the yields increase if better varieties are grown? Are onion seeds better than sets for growing in this garden? What would change if the ground cover fabric was not used? Will weed seeds build up in the soil if we continue to use grasses and other rough material as sheet composting? And how much more can this garden produce with less time spent? It is interesting that with so few crops and relatively simple methods, there are still so many questions, and possibly many more. I think part of this is because the 4 crops we are growing are not so easy to grow or have definite pest and disease issues. But perhaps I'm simply able to explore all of this in more depth with this garden because there are so few crops, whereas in the other gardens there is always so much more going on that it's hard to focus in on the detail. But perhaps it only takes a closer look to discover many more questions.